Hey, how's it going? If you use the GH5 or the GH5S and you want a really quick way to be able to get a time-lapse or a hyperlapse, then this video might be for you. So the regular way to do a hyperlapse is painstaking. Ordinarily, you're sticking the camera on a tripod, you're taking a photograph, then you're taking one step forward or another unit of measurement that you can keep consistent, and then you're taking another photograph after making sure that your framing is exactly the same. Then you do the whole process again. You take another step forward, take a photograph, etc, etc. If you've got a 24 frames a second project, you've got to take 24 photos just to get 1 second of footage. Then when you've got all the photos together, you're probably going to be using something like Lightroom to be able to get all those photos into a video to put into your video editor. The results, although painstaking, can be stunning, and I'm not really looking to beat that process. I'm just trying to explore an alternative which might get somewhat close to that without all that time and effort. So on the GH5 or GH5S, you can stick it into variable frame rate mode, which is what you'd use to get slow motion. You'd change that to 60 or 120 or 125 frames a second. Instead, if we ramp it down, we can get to 2 frames a second of video. And this is where it comes in super handy for a time-lapse or a hyperlapse kind of situation. Now, an obvious alternative would be just to shoot video and then speed that up in post. Casey Neistat will do that all the time, for example. But that looks quite jarring and not quite as pleasing as a real hyperlapse or time-lapse. There's going to be little or no motion blur there to smooth out all the people's faces and all the movement and all the lights and things like that to make it look a bit more dreamy and a bit more professional looking. With a shutter speed of 4, you're getting a decent amount of motion blur on people's faces, especially if they're whizzing by the lens. So the areas on the outside of the lens that are close to you are going to be moving really quickly, and you'll get a good amount of blur on those. Things that are a bit further off or in the center of frame should be a bit sharper. So if you want a hyperlapse with this setup, you stick the camera onto a gimbal and just walk with it, shooting video. And the results are what you saw at the beginning of this video. For me personally, probably not good enough for a feature film, but for YouTube or something a bit more casual, I think it's a good effect and it's usable. So there are some hefty pros to this approach in my view. First of all, it looks better than just shooting regular video and speeding it up because it's less jarring and you've got some motion blur there. Not to mention it takes up less memory than regular video because it's shooting so few frames. So rather than 60 or 24 frames a second, it's only shooting 2. So it's actually really efficient memory-wise. It's obviously miles quicker than taking a regular photo-based hyperlapse where you're taking a photo and a step, etc. But not just to shoot it, also in post, you don't have to deal with a bunch of files. You don't have to deal with Lightroom at all. You end up with one video file, you stick in your editor, and you can manipulate it from there. While you're out in the field as well, you've got the benefit of being able to review it straight away. So as soon as you stop hitting record, you can press play and you can watch it back and you know whether it's good enough or not. Whereas with a regular hyperlapse, you've got a lot of stills there and you can probably judge if they're looking okay or not, but you don't really know until you get it back into the edit room. And you might be thinking you don't need to round trip through Lightroom because you can just dump those pictures straight into your video editor. And while that may be true, at least on Final Cut, you can't actually stabilize a bunch of photos. It doesn't really deal with a bunch of 1,000 photos very well. So being able to import just one video just makes life so much easier, and you can hit stabilize and Final Cut will do something with that stabilization. And lastly, there should be no flickering in your video file when you're doing the time-lapse or hyperlapse. Now you'll know if you've ever done a photo-based time-lapse or hyperlapse, there is a chance you could end up with flickering. Even if you leave the camera in manual mode and the light levels aren't changing, you can still get that flicker, whereas if you're shooting in video, you shouldn't at all. What are the cons that you need to be aware of if you're thinking about employing this? Well, obviously if you're shooting photos for your hyperlapse or time-lapse, you'll probably be getting raw images out of them. And you can do so much more with RAW than you can with a video file, which is obvious. You can bring up exposure and not have to suffer the noise. You can do much more with the colors. You shouldn't see as much banding, things like that. You'll get a lot more flexibility out of RAW than you do the video file. This hyperlapse method also depends on you having a gimbal. So there's an expense there if you don't already have one, but also it comes down to your prowess with the gimbal, how you can keep it dead straight and level. And if you're trying any other kind of movement like an orbit or a pan, you'll know from using your gimbal it's very difficult to keep your subject dead center in the frame. If you don't keep it dead center in the frame, it's got a chance of being blurry because obviously you've got motion there and you've got such a long shutter speed. Now that's not a problem on a tripod where you can get the framing set up for every photo. That's why it takes so long, but you're guaranteed to get what you want in focus right in the middle of the frame, whereas on a gimbal, it's a bit more hit and miss and it depends how good you are with it. Just to underline that major point on the sharpness, If you're on a gimbal moving the camera with a shutter speed of 4, nothing's going to be really pin sharp unless it's a long way in the distance and you're super steady with the gimbal. So you need to be aware that there is a little bit of a trade-off from not doing the tripod method. And the last thing to note is that the VFR mode only goes down to 2 frames a second, just in case you were thinking you wanted to shoot less than that. So you could in theory bring the shutter speed down to 2 as well if you wanted to try that, but you couldn't get any lower than 2. Not that you'd want to on a gimbal, because there's a chance that everything would just be a blurry mess. So for me, this is a possible workaround where you want that hyperlapse blurry kind of action, but you don't really want to go through the whole hassle of it all. You're probably not going to get that perfect hyperlapse result doing this, but at least it's really quick to edit and it's quick to shoot. So if you're in a pinch and you really want to get that shot and it's going to add to your story, this is a decent way of going about it. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in a bit.